Avoidant people rarely cross this particular line with empaths unless the love is real. Picture discovering that the clearest sign of love isn't a big confession, isn't constant texting, isn't even hearing the words, "I love you." Picture learning that for certain people, the truest proof of love is crossing a boundary they've spent their whole life defending. A line so sacred, so carefully guarded, that almost no one ever gets access to what lies past it. If you've ever cared for someone avoidant, you've probably asked yourself a painful question at some point. Do they actually love me, or am I just one more person standing outside walls they never intend to lower? The honest answer is more complicated than most people assume, because avoidant people don't measure love the way everyone else does. They don't show their feelings through dramatic gestures or hours of emotional conversation. Instead, their deepest emotions usually hide beneath layers of distance, silence, and self-protection. But there's one specific line they almost never cross unless what they feel is genuine. And once you understand exactly what that line is, so much of their confusing behavior finally starts to make sense. To understand why this boundary matters so much, you first have to see the world the way an avoidant person sees it. Most people assume avoidant behavior comes from not caring enough. In reality, plenty of avoidant people create distance precisely because caring feels dangerous to them. Long before any relationship starts, they've usually already developed a deep-rooted belief that depending on other people equals risk, whether it came from painful experiences, emotional letdowns, inconsistent relationships growing up, or simply learning to rely only on themselves. They become experts at guarding their independence. Their emotional space becomes sacred territory, the one place where they feel safe, where they hold on to control, and where nobody can catch them off guard and hurt them. This is exactly why avoidant people often seem so comfortable handling everything solo. They take pride in being self-sufficient. They rarely want to burden anyone else. They rarely ask for help. They often convince themselves they simply don't need what most people naturally crave. From the outside, this can look like pure confidence, and sometimes it genuinely is. But underneath that independence often sits a quiet fear that getting too close to someone means giving up the very thing that keeps them feeling secure. Every relationship they enter creates this invisible internal tension. Part of them wants real connection. Another part fears exactly what that connection might eventually cost them. That tug of war sits at the center of nearly every avoidant relationship dynamic. This is exactly where empaths enter the story. There's something strangely magnetic about the pull between avoidant people and empaths. On the surface, they seem like total opposites. Empaths move toward emotions. Avoidant people move away from them. Empaths crave understanding, closeness, emotional depth. Avoidant people tend to seem hesitant, guarded, hard to reach. And yet, these very differences often spark a powerful attraction. Avoidant people frequently find themselves drawn to the warmth an empath naturally carries. They notice the patience, the acceptance, the ability to sit with emotion without rushing to judge it. Empaths often offer something avoidant people secretly crave but rarely know how to ask for: genuine emotional safety. At the same time, empaths often become fascinated by the mystery surrounding avoidant people. They sense a hidden depth beneath the walls. They sense there's more going on than the avoidant person is willing to reveal. This creates a powerful dynamic where both people become deeply invested, though for entirely different reasons, and that difference also creates real friction. The empath wants more openness. The avoidant person wants connection, but fears losing control over it, and the closer they grow, the more that tension intensifies. Eventually, every avoidant person reaches a point where they have to decide whether the connection is worth the risk it demands. What many people don't realize is that avoidant individuals often fear losing control far more than they fear being rejected outright. Rejection hurts, sure, but dependence feels even more threatening to them. The idea that someone else's actions could meaningfully shake their emotional state feels deeply uncomfortable. They might genuinely enjoy someone's company. They might think about that person constantly. They might care far more than they'll ever admit out loud, but the moment they notice themselves becoming emotionally dependent, internal alarm bells start ringing. Suddenly, they need space. Suddenly, they become harder to read. Suddenly they seem more distant, even as their actual feelings keep growing stronger underneath. This is one of the most misunderstood parts of avoidant psychology. Plenty of people read withdrawal as a lack of interest, when sometimes it's the exact opposite. The stronger their feelings grow, the more exposed they feel. The more exposed they feel, the stronger their instinct becomes to protect themselves. It creates a frustrating cycle where love and fear compete for control. One side wants closeness, the other wants safety. And until one side wins out, the relationship can feel confusing for both people involved, because underneath it all sits the invisible wall every avoidant person maintains. That wall isn't necessarily built from arrogance, coldness, or selfishness. More often, it's built purely from protection. It separates the parts of themselves they're willing to share from the parts they keep hidden from nearly everyone. Most people only ever encounter the outer surface of that wall. They might receive affection, attention, and companionship, but they never actually gain access to the deeper emotional landscape underneath. This is exactly why liking someone and trusting someone are two completely different experiences for an avoidant person. They can genuinely enjoy being around someone without giving that person any real influence over their inner world. They can care deeply while still maintaining strict emotional boundaries. They can stay physically and emotionally present while still keeping one foot near the exit. That wall stays intact because it preserves their sense of control. But every so often, someone comes along who changes everything. Someone who consistently feels safe. Someone who doesn't demand vulnerability, but quietly earns it over time. Someone whose presence starts mattering in ways the avoidant person never planned for or intended. And when that happens, the invisible wall starts to crack. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly enough that even the avoidant person might not fully realize what's happening because the line they swore they'd never cross is starting to come into view. And crossing that line will reveal whether what they feel is simple attachment or something far deeper. This is where things get genuinely fascinating, because when an empath starts getting too close, something fairly predictable tends to happen inside an avoidant person. At first, everything seems to move in a positive direction. Conversations become more meaningful. The connection feels stronger. Trust seems to be building. Then, almost out of nowhere, the avoidant person starts pulling back. Their responses become less frequent. They seem distracted. They create distance where there used to be closeness. For the empath, this shift can feel absolutely heartbreaking because it seems to contradict everything that came before it. Just as the connection started feeling real, it suddenly feels at risk. But what's actually happening underneath the surface is usually very different from how it looks. The avoidant person isn't necessarily running from the empath. More often, they're running from what the relationship is starting to stir up inside them. The closer the empath gets, the harder it becomes for the avoidant person to keep pretending they're completely unaffected. Emotional investment becomes impossible to deny. The relationship starts taking up more mental space. The possibility of loss becomes real. The possibility of actually needing someone becomes real. And for someone who spent years convincing themselves self-reliance is the only safe path, that realization can feel completely overwhelming. So they start trying to regain their emotional footing. They seek distance, not because the connection means nothing, but because it suddenly means far too much. This is one of the great paradoxes people rarely understand. An avoidant person's retreat is often triggered by growing significance, not fading interest. But eventually, if the bond keeps deepening, a moment arrives that separates casual attachment from genuine love. This is the line hinted at from the very start, the line avoidant people almost never cross unless their feelings run truly deep. It's the moment they start letting another person's presence actually influence their decisions. To most people, this might sound completely ordinary. In healthy relationships, factoring in someone else's feelings is just expected. But for an avoidant person, this represents a major psychological shift. Remember, independence isn't just a preference for them, it's a protective structure built around their entire identity. Their decisions are usually guided by personal needs, personal goals, personal comfort. They instinctively guard their freedom, because freedom feels safe to them. Yet when love becomes real, something remarkable starts happening. They begin asking themselves questions they normally wouldn't think to ask. How will this affect the other person? What would help them feel secure? What choice actually supports the relationship instead of just supporting me? These questions might sound simple on the surface, but for an avoidant person, they signal a gradual surrender of emotional isolation. They're no longer operating as though they exist entirely on their own. Someone else's happiness starts carrying real weight. Someone else's pain becomes hard to ignore. And maybe most significantly, they start accepting that the relationship deserves consideration right alongside their own needs. None of this is forced. It's not done out of obligation. It happens simply because that person has become emotionally significant enough to break through walls that once seemed completely impenetrable. What makes this shift so meaningful is that it usually shows up in small moments, long before anything dramatic happens. An avoidant person who genuinely loves someone won't necessarily become emotionally expressive overnight. They likely won't deliver passionate speeches or reveal every buried feeling all at once. Instead, their love tends to surface through subtle changes in behavior. They start adjusting plans to accommodate someone else. They remember small details that matter. They become more attentive to emotional cues. They find themselves caring about outcomes that never would have concerned them before. For maybe the first time in a long while, someone else's emotional experience starts shaping their own choices. Avoidant people can become attached while still keeping their deepest self carefully protected. They can enjoy companionship, lean on familiar routines, appreciate someone's presence, all without ever fully dropping their guard. Attachment often exists comfortably within established boundaries. Love asks for something more. Love requires trust. It requires emotional risk. It requires letting someone else's well-being matter in ways that create genuine vulnerability. An avoidant person might stay attached to someone simply because the relationship feels comfortable. But when they start making decisions that prioritize the connection, when they start weighing someone else's emotional reality alongside their own, when they willingly expose themselves to the uncertainty that comes with caring deeply, attachment starts evolving into something far more profound. This is exactly why some avoidant people can stay in relationships for years without ever truly crossing that internal threshold. They might care, they might value the relationship, but genuine love only begins where self-protection stops dominating every single choice. It begins the moment connection becomes worth the risk. And perhaps the most beautiful part of this whole process is that the signs are usually visible long before an avoidant person ever puts any of it into words. You start noticing subtle shifts in consistency. The disappearing acts happen less often. The emotional walls stop feeling quite so tall. There's less urgency to bolt whenever intimacy increases. Conversations start reaching places that used to be completely off limits. Instead of immediately retreating the moment emotions get uncomfortable, they stay present a little longer. They listen more carefully. They share more openly. They allow themselves to be seen in ways that once felt impossible. These shifts might look small to anyone watching from the outside, but they represent enormous internal victories. Every moment of consistency challenges an old fear. Every act of openness is a step past familiar defenses. Every decision that puts connection ahead of self-protection reflects an internal battle slowly being won. This is exactly why understanding avoidant people requires looking past surface-level behavior. Their most meaningful expressions of love are usually quiet ones. They show up in the gradual lowering of defenses, the growing willingness to stay emotionally present, and the increasing acceptance that someone else has become important enough to shape their world. And as those walls keep softening, something even more revealing starts to happen. The avoidant person begins opening the one door they've spent a lifetime guarding, access to their inner world. And once that door starts opening, everything shifts. The moment an avoidant person begins sharing their inner world, the relationship moves into territory almost nobody ever reaches with them. Most avoidant people spend years carefully controlling what other people get to see. They'll share opinions, experiences, humor, even certain personal stories. But there are deeper layers that stay hidden from nearly everyone. These are the fears they rarely admit to, the disappointments they still carry, the moments that shaped how they see relationships, and the vulnerabilities they've trained themselves to keep locked away. What makes this so significant is that avoidant people don't usually guard these parts of themselves because they enjoy secrecy. They guard them because exposure genuinely feels dangerous. Somewhere along the way, they learned that vulnerability could lead to pain, disappointment, judgment, or a total loss of control. So when they start revealing pieces of their inner landscape, they're not simply sharing information, they're taking a real risk. They're letting someone witness parts of themselves that can't easily be hidden again once seen. This is why an avoidant person opening up is rarely a casual thing. It usually unfolds gradually, almost accidentally at first. A deeper conversation than usual, a confession they never planned to make, a memory they haven't spoken about in years. To an empath, these moments might feel natural, but to the avoidant person, they can feel absolutely monumental. Every disclosure carries a quiet fear about what the other person might do with that trust. And when they keep opening up despite that fear, it signals something powerful. The relationship has become more important to them than the safety of total emotional concealment. Ironically, this is also where a lot of empaths accidentally miss what's actually happening. Because empaths tend to measure progress through emotional intensity, they sometimes overlook the significance of subtler transformation. They might be hoping for dramatic declarations, obvious vulnerability, clear verbal reassurance. When those things don't show up quickly, they assume little has actually changed. Meanwhile, the avoidant person could be making enormous emotional strides that go completely unnoticed. The avoidant person who used to disappear during difficult conversations now stays present. The one who used to keep every struggle private now shares fragments of their internal world. The one who used to prioritize distance above everything else is beginning to allow real closeness. But because these shifts don't always look dramatic, they often get misread. This creates one of the most painful disconnects between avoidant people and empaths. The empath may feel unseen because they're waiting for bigger, louder expressions of love. The avoidant person may feel unseen too because their quiet efforts keep going unrecognized. Neither one fully understands the emotional language the other is speaking. The truth is, avoidant people often express affection through changed behavior rather than changed words. Their love becomes visible through consistency, trust, presence, and their willingness to stay engaged even when every instinct is screaming at them to retreat. These signs are easy to miss if someone is only watching for conventional signs of intimacy. As the relationship deepens further, another remarkable shift starts emerging. The avoidant person begins making sacrifices they'd normally refuse to make. This doesn't mean abandoning who they are or suddenly becoming a completely different person. It means loosening the rigid, self-protective patterns that used to govern every single decision. For years, protecting their emotional safety may have been the top priority. Comfort came first, distance came first, independence came first, but genuine love starts rearranging those priorities. The avoidant person begins tolerating discomfort for the sake of the relationship. They engage in conversations they'd normally sidestep. They stay emotionally available during moments that make them genuinely uneasy. They become willing to work through conflict instead of running from it. These sacrifices might look small from the outside, but internally they represent profound change. Every compromise challenges a long-held belief that vulnerability must always be avoided. Every effort to stay connected during uncomfortable moments loosens the grip of old defenses. This is exactly why real love so often transforms avoidant people in ways that can't be measured by grand gestures. The transformation happens quietly, through repeated decisions to choose connection even when self-protection would clearly be easier. One of the clearest examples of this shift shows up when they stop planning only for themselves. For most of their lives, avoidant people get used to navigating the world as independent units. Their plans, goals, routines, and future decisions tend to be structured entirely around personal autonomy. They instinctively protect their flexibility, because flexibility protects their freedom. But when someone becomes deeply important to them, something changes. Future decisions start including that other person almost automatically. The avoidant person begins considering how upcoming choices might affect the relationship. They start thinking in terms of shared experiences instead of purely individual ones. They begin picturing future possibilities that include someone else standing right beside them. This shift matters enormously because future planning requires trust. It requires believing the relationship deserves a real place within their long-term vision. Plenty of avoidant people resist this level of integration because it creates genuine vulnerability. The more someone becomes woven into their future, the more painful it would be to lose them. But once love becomes real, avoiding that risk becomes harder and harder to sustain. The avoidant person slowly starts making room for someone else in spaces that used to be reserved exclusively for themselves. What was once simply my future gradually starts becoming our future, even if they never actually say those exact words out loud. And this brings us to one of the most misunderstood aspects of avoidant devotion. Their deepest acts of love often hide inside completely ordinary moments. Popular culture trains people to look for dramatic romance, passionate speeches, highly visible displays of affection. Avoidant people frequently express devotion in entirely different ways. They show up when it counts. They remember the details that matter. They become dependable. They quietly solve problems. They create stability. They protect the connection through actions that often go completely unnoticed simply because they seem so ordinary. And yet these behaviors carry enormous emotional weight. For an avoidant person, reliability isn't just a habit. It's often a genuine expression of commitment. Consistency isn't just convenience. It's a quiet declaration that someone matters enough to stay present for. This is exactly why understanding avoidant love requires paying attention to what they consistently do rather than fixating only on what they say. Their devotion tends to live in patterns rather than promises. It reveals itself through effort rather than performance. And the deeper their feelings grow, the more these quiet demonstrations accumulate, until a much bigger picture finally comes into focus, one that reveals something extraordinary. The avoidant person who once seemed emotionally unreachable isn't just protecting themselves from connection anymore. They're actively choosing connection despite the fears still sitting underneath. Yet beneath all these changes, a hidden struggle keeps unfolding, a private battle between longing and fear that most people never actually witness. And understanding that battle might be the key to understanding everything that comes next. What makes the avoidant journey so hard to understand from the outside is that even while all these positive changes unfold, an internal battle keeps raging beneath the surface the whole time. A lot of people assume that once an avoidant person falls in love, all their fear simply vanishes and everything suddenly gets easy. The reality is often the exact opposite. The deeper their feelings grow, the more intense the internal conflict can actually become. One part of them longs for real connection. It wants closeness, understanding, companionship, emotional security. It wants to stay. It wants to trust. It wants to believe love can exist without costing them their sense of self. But another part of them stays constantly vigilant, always scanning for danger. It remembers every disappointment, every emotional wound, every experience that once taught them vulnerability leads to pain. These two forces often exist at exactly the same time, which is why avoidant people can sometimes seem so contradictory. They move closer, then hesitate. They open up, then pull back. They express affection, then suddenly go quiet. To an outside observer, these shifts can feel genuinely confusing. Internally, though, they usually reflect someone trying to reconcile two competing needs that both feel essential: the need for connection and the need for protection. And when genuine love enters the picture, neither side simply vanishes. Instead, the person has to slowly figure out which side deserves more influence over their future. This is also exactly why certain empaths become extraordinarily important to avoidant people. It's not because they're perfect. It's not because they always say the right thing. It's because they create an emotional environment that feels genuinely different from anything the avoidant person has experienced before. They offer acceptance without constant pressure. They create space without abandoning the connection. They show patience without giving up their own needs in the process. Most importantly, they let the avoidant person feel understood instead of judged. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Avoidant people often spend years feeling misunderstood. Their distance gets read as indifference. Their silence gets read as not caring. Their hesitation gets read as rejection. Over time, these misunderstandings can push them to withdraw even further. But when they finally encounter someone who sees past the defenses and recognizes the fear underneath them, something powerful happens. The avoidant person starts feeling emotionally safer than they ever thought possible. They start experiencing a connection that doesn't demand perfection from them. The empath becomes associated with acceptance instead of pressure, understanding instead of criticism, safety instead of danger. And because those experiences are genuinely rare for them, they leave a lasting imprint. Long after individual conversations fade from memory, the emotional experience of feeling truly understood stays behind. Eventually, a moment arrives that a lot of avoidant people never expect. A point where the relationship stops being something they simply enjoy and becomes something they genuinely cannot imagine losing. This is the point of no return, not because the relationship becomes flawless, but because their emotional reality fundamentally shifts. Up until now, they may have clung to the comforting illusion that they could walk away if they needed to, that they could reclaim complete independence and return to full emotional self-sufficiency. But then comes the realization that this connection has become woven into their life in ways they can no longer ignore. The other person's happiness matters to them. Their absence would matter. Their pain matters. Their presence has become a genuine source of comfort, stability, and meaning. This realization can be both beautiful and terrifying at once. Beautiful because it reflects real love. Terrifying because it removes the emotional distance that once felt so protective. Suddenly, there's something real on the line to lose. Suddenly, the relationship carries emotional stakes that can't be minimized or explained away. Plenty of avoidant people spend a long time resisting this realization, but once it fully settles in, their behavior tends to shift in subtle but unmistakable ways. They become more intentional, more present, more invested, not because their fear has disappeared, but because the relationship has become more important to them than that fear. And this brings us to the ultimate sign that an avoidant person genuinely loves an empath. It isn't constant texting, it isn't dramatic romance, it isn't flawless communication, it's something far deeper. It's their willingness to cross the line of complete emotional self-protection, the same line that's quietly shaped so many of their choices throughout their entire life. When an avoidant person truly loves someone, they stop treating vulnerability as something to be avoided at all costs. They start accepting the reality that caring deeply means risking real pain. They let someone else's emotions affect them. They let someone else's needs influence them. They let someone else's presence become significant enough to actually change them. This is the line they rarely cross, because it requires surrendering the illusion of total emotional independence. It requires admitting that someone genuinely matters, not in a casual way, not in a temporary way, but in a way that fundamentally alters how they experience the world. For an avoidant person, this is one of the greatest acts of trust imaginable. It's not the absence of fear, it's choosing connection despite the fear. It's choosing intimacy despite the uncertainty. It's choosing love despite every old instinct that once insisted staying guarded was the safer path. And maybe that's the most important lesson buried in all of this. Real love doesn't always look identical from person to person. For avoidant people, love is often much quieter than most people expect. It's found in consistency instead of intensity, in presence instead of performance, in gradual trust instead of instant openness. The hidden line we've explored throughout all of this was never really about one specific behavior. It was about something much deeper, about letting another human being matter enough that self-protection stops being the highest priority. That's the transformation that reveals genuine love, not because avoidant people stop valuing their independence, but because they discover something they end up valuing even more: connection, trust, shared meaning, and the courage to let someone into places they once believed had to stay closed forever. So if you've ever wondered whether an avoidant person is capable of truly loving someone, the answer is yes. But their love is usually written in actions that take patience to recognize. It shows up in walls that slowly come down, in choices that quietly become more inclusive, and in a willingness to stay emotionally present even when every old defense is screaming at them to run. Because when an avoidant person finally crosses that line, they're doing something far more significant than simply opening their heart. They're rewriting the rules they've lived by for years. And for someone who spent a lifetime protecting themselves, there may be no greater expression of love than that.